بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
Hi, my name is Aatiya. I am going to be doing a class today on a topic that says modesty brings nothing except good. But what does that mean? I'm really excited, and feel free to interact and type in the comments and stuff like that. If you've got any questions, or if you want me to go slower or go back and re-explain something, or if you have even reflections or gems, I'd love to hear it. So feel free to chat away if you want. So the reason I kind of want you guys to just close your eyes for a second, and imagine you're walking down a road and you come across a fork in the road. On one side, you see what looks like a giant party, right? Everyone's doing whatever they want to do. If you want chocolate pie for dinner, which, I mean, who wouldn't want chocolate pie for dinner? Done, right? You want to drive a cool car, you find it, you take it, done, right? You want to play games all day and not go to school, sold, right? Whatever your deepest, darkest desire is, it'll be fulfilled, right? You don't have to worry about consequences in that sense of what will my parents say or anything like that. You just do it, right? And then you look on the other side and you see a lot more order and calmness, right? It definitely doesn't look like the party that you're seeing on the other side, right? The party is full of colors. You're probably seeing smoke from people doing whatever they want to do. Maybe something's caught on fire, but it doesn't matter. You're just having a party, right? We don't focus on the problems on that side. You only focus on what you want to do. On the other side, it's a whole lot lighter, there's definitely no smoke and no party and no loud noises or anything like that, but it just seems calmer. It doesn't seem as much fun, right? And the people are more orderly, they're dressed nicely, they're using manners, they're not being too loud, they're doing what they're supposed to do. Kids are in school, adults are at work, etc., right? The thing is, it just seems a little bit less fun, and more restrictive, right? So my question to you guys is which road would you go down? And I want you guys to think about that question as we go through this. So Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Okay, so I want to bring up two hadith first. The first hadith is found in Sahih Bukhari, and it says that, and this is where the topic or the title of the program comes from. Imran bin Hussein said that the Prophet said, heyo, which is precious shyness from committing religious indiscretions. And we're going to talk more about what all these words mean, but I just want to show you where this topic's even coming from. Does not bring anything except good. Thereupon, Bashir bin Ka'b said, it is written in the wisdom papers, Haya leads to solemnity, which that it can be defined as dignity, and it leads to tranquility, peace of mind. Imran said to him, I'm narrating to you the saying of Allah's Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and you are speaking about your paper, the wisdom book, right? And then the next, and one thing I want to say is Haya hasn't been defined yet, so I know I haven't defined it, but just stick with me on this, right? I just want to present the two hadith first. And then the next hadith is Haya. Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu narrates that the Messenger of Allah said, Al-Haya is from faith, and faith is from paradise. Obscenity, which means being offensive or offensiveness, is from rudeness, and rudeness is in the fire. And this is from Tirmidhi. Hadith number 2009. So, my first question is, what does haya mean? You can type it in the chat if you've heard this word, and maybe what it means or what you've heard it mean. And you can type that in there if you want. And if no one has an idea of what it means, that's okay. Okay. Okay, so someone said shyness, decency, and that's a like good like initial definition, right? Bashfulness, great. So haya is an Arabic word. We usually translate it as modesty, right? And one thing that you have to learn or realize about Arabic that isn't like necessarily true with like the English language, for example, is Arabic is like a giant onion, right? Like there are so many layers to not only the grammar but also the words, right? So heya is an Arabic word, but it has multiple definitions to it, right? So the first thing that we learn is that heya has two ways of looking at it, or two ways it can be categorized or defined. The first way is the natural definition of what haya means. And this is like how you guys have been defining it, you know, modesty, bashfulness, shamefulness, you know, shyness, decency, etc. But then there's like the Islamic version of it, which means moral conscience, right? Like knowing what is morally right and wrong. So the origins of this word is that it comes from the word hayya, which means life. And one thing like the Arabics, you know, the Arabs did with like the Arabic language is, you know, they called rain hayya, right? Because it gives life to the earth, right? Just like haya, which is how we defined it as like, you know, shame and decency and bashfulness, etc. Haya is something that brings like the dead heart to life, right? So if you don't have haya, you're like a dead person. So natural haya, and I'm going to be covering both sides of this through our conversation today. So natural haya is basically that feeling of shame that people talk about, right? And one example that's commonly used is like the shame that you feel when you're unclothed, right? You want to like cover like certain body parts and like make sure your aura is covered. And I think like a lot of times the conversation on like haya and modesty focuses only on clothing, right? But that's not what my point of this conversation is, and that's not why this topic was chosen by me, because haya means more than just clothes, right? It's definitely a part of it, and you know, this is where like that natural haya falls into, but there's so much more to it, right? And the bulk of my like talk today will focus more on like the other aspects of haya and modesty and what it means. And so like is haya is like, it is something that is found naturally in all people throughout like cultures and all times, right? Regardless of where you go to, every like culture, every you know, era, time zone, like time, like place, everything, there is like an idea of what is and is not appropriate, right? And this isn't just when it comes to clothing, but like in behaviors, etc., right? And so when it comes to like haya, especially when it refers to like clothing and stuff like that, you know, the Quran kind of talks about this with, you know, our parents Adam alayhi salam and Hawa alayhi salam. In Surah Al-Araf, verse 20 to 22, where Allah says that like Shaitan basically whispered to, you know, our parents, and they ate from the tree. They, you know, and this is a tree that Allah told them not to eat from, right? And the way that Shaitan does this is he tells them that, you know, if you eat from this tree, you'll become angels or immortals, right? And I think that's like a very important thing to reflect on, because even like it's just a very like natural human like part of us to there was a question that came in. Sorry, I was just reading it. And inshallah, I will get to your question, but if I don't, just type it in again, because I'm hoping that inshallah, like as we go through, like that part will be answered or becomes more clear. So basically, Shaitan like tricks, you know, and like not only like tricks, but like convinces and plays into like the deepest, darkest, like wants and wishes of our parents by saying, oh, you'll be like the angels, because like the angels are pretty cool, right? They've got like wings, they live like a really long time, etc., right? Or immortals, right? Like living forever. And he's like, I promise I'm giving you like really good advice, like believe me. But really, like, he was just giving them lies, right? And so like once they ate from the tree that they weren't supposed to, like their clothes fall off and like, they're completely uncovered. But remember, we talked about both like natural haya and the Islamic one. And the thing is, by disobeying Allah, both like the natural part, which is like the clothed part, the shame, the modesty part was affected, but also like the Islamic part was affected, right? They disobeyed Allah, right? And we're all guilty of disobeying Allah. So it's not like, we're not like, oh, how dare you do this or anything like that. Like we have to be respectful, right? And so like one thing we learn is like even, Adam alayhi salam and Hawa alayhi salam were people who were they were like afflicted by this, right? Like they had these kind of same issues that we have today in terms of like not always like obeying Allah, right? And so Allah like asked them, he said, did I not tell you, like you're not supposed to do that? Did I not tell you shaitan's your enemy, right? And so these are the things where like this is where like the natural haya comes into play, but then also the Islamic haya comes into play. And so from the Islamic haya point, Islamic haya just means like moral conscience. What is morally correct? What is morally right to do? Right versus wrong. And so this has like 3 areas where we need to apply like moral consciousness or like awareness or mindfulness. We have to apply it with like Allah, people, and ourselves, right? And so there's a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ says, Haya, and this was narrated by Abdullah ibn Masud. This comes from Tirmidhi also, where the Prophet ﷺ says, have Haya for Allah, as it is his due. That means he is owed that. He said, this is Abdullah ibn Masud, we said, O Prophet of Allah, we have Haya, and all praise is due to Allah. He said, not that, right? Because that's like modesty and all this other stuff. Not that, but having haya for Allah, which is due to protect the head and what it contains. That means be mindful of what the head and what it contains, meaning using like your senses, or which is like your eyes, your ears, your tongue, your brain, in a way that makes Allah happy. And protect the insides and what it includes, right? And this means be mindful of the stomach and what it includes, what you eat, what you consume. Like all of these things are included, but also like what things are near your stomach, right? Your arms, like your legs, your heart is near the stomach, right? So be mindful of, and consume isn't just like what you eat in this case, but like what you put into your heart, right? Like, are you putting yourself in situations where like you're very angry, for example, and your heart just becomes hard and angry and bitter, right? If you're like maybe like watching like, I don't know, like TV or hanging out with certain friends who are just very like pessimistic or whatever, and then that's influencing how your heart behaves and how your haya is going to be, right? Because morally it's going to be affected in the sense of like maybe when you see like someone struggling or someone suffering, you're not going to have that same level of like kindness or like mercy towards that response. You're just going to be like, yeah, whatever, right? That's not what Muslims are supposed to do. That's not how we're supposed to interact and whatnot. And then the hadith goes on to say, and remember death and the trial. Remember death and the trial means when it becomes hard, remember that all of this ends, like this dunya ends, right? And I understand like the struggle is real. We're going to be in situations where like we really want to just, like lean into what we want when we want it, right? But like restraining ourselves and always like remembering that like all of this is going to end. Like even if we lean into that desire, and let's say the desire is like, I want to eat cake for dinner, right? Like that's not healthy. That's not something that's going to, you know, be nutritious, and it's not going to like be fuel for like, you know, making you like pray more or whatever, right? And so like remembering that like all of this ends is very important, and the trial in the grave begins, right? And like when they say trial, like, you know, you see like you're starting to be judged already. You'll see either like the doors of Jannah or like the doors of, you know, Jahannam, like facing you, right? And so like these are things that we should like be very like aware of, that like, you know, there are consequences. Just because like someone doesn't see us, like for example not praying, doesn't mean that Allah doesn't see us, right? And then it goes on to say, and whoever intends the hereafter, he leaves the adornments of the world. And that is basically everything that's like super glittery and important, important like this, right? Not like actually important in this world is fake, right? All the money, all the power, all the influence, all the like likes that we get on social media, etc. Like all of that is fake. Like it doesn't amount to anything. Like even all the money in the world, is it going to like benefit you in Jannah or with Allah if you didn't use it well, right? But let's say you had like a little bit of money, but you used it well, you know, like you used it like for Allah or to help people, etc. And then that money goes farther than all the money in the world if you had it and you used it for just like, you know, like buying a lot of things, or just like, you know, taking vacations like every weekend or something, you know. And I'm not saying like vacations aren't important or needed and stuff like that. Like all of that is important, but it's in terms of like moderation, right? And so whoever does that, then he indeed has fulfilled haya, meaning haya with haya, which Allah is due, right? So I want to first talk about Allah, right? And the haya that we're supposed to have with Allah. And then we need to remember that our relationship with Allah is the most important relationship we're ever going to have. It's more important than our parents and siblings and friends. It is the most important relationship. Like your parents, siblings, friends, like all of those relationships are important, but it's never going to be as important as Allah, right? And so there's a question that people ask, you know, if a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? And this is something like a lot of people talk about, but I don't like, I've never really understood why, you know, like this question is even a question, because the answer is yes. Because even if people aren't around to hear it, like Allah hears it, right? Allah hears everything, Allah sees everything. And so we need to always remember, like, just like, you know, with this question, just like this tree, like if something happens, Allah knows. And so even when we're by ourselves, right, like Allah is watching, whether it's us like watching something on TV that we're not supposed to, or listening to something that we're not supposed to, going on websites we're not supposed to, using apps in ways that we're not supposed to. And I know like a lot of times with like, you know, parents and stuff like that, like sometimes like our friends are all like doing, I don't know, like TikTok or Snapchat or whatever like the new like app craze is, right? And maybe our parents have no idea like what we're actually doing or what pictures we're taking, you know, of ourselves, or like how we're like speaking in these videos or behaving in these videos, but Allah knows, right? And so sometimes like there's this idea of like, well, if I don't get caught by my parents, it's okay, like I'm not going to be in trouble. But you have to realize that Allah is always watching, right? And so Allah always sees, Allah always hears. He knows like what you're thinking, what you're feeling, even if you don't say it, right? But this isn't always just like with like stuff that we're not supposed to do. Like this also applies to things that we are supposed to do, right? For example, when we pray salah, right? That's something we're supposed to do. When we're by ourselves, do we like rush it really fast? Like, you know, like Dhuhr is done in like a minute, right? Versus when we're praying, maybe like Maghrib in front of like a Jama'ah or something like that, and we're like, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, instead of when we're by ourselves, right? Like how do we pray, when people see us versus when no one sees us? Sometimes the question is, do you even pray? If like your parents aren't telling you to do it, or like like your friends or like your whatever. And then the other question is like, will you still do good deeds if no one is around to see it? And I think this was something that like happened a lot, once like all the like social unrest things were going on, at least here in America, where people would do something nice, but they would do it in a way where it was just about like the publicity and the PR and making sure people saw what you did so you got a lot of likes, right? Versus, like what did people do when the cameras were off or you weren't like recording every single thing and posting every single good thing that you did, Or even like some people who, they'll do the humble bragging where it's like, I'm so tired from reading like Tahajjud this morning, but it was so good, right? Like Allah saw it, like you don't need to like let other people know about it, right? And so like having haya with Allah in that case is like not even like humble bragging, not even, you don't need to post that on there. That's like between you and Allah, right? Like the whole point of Tahajjud is like praying at a time when like everyone's like sleeping and no one knows, right? And so this is where you have to kind of like remember your relationship with Allah is like the most protected thing that needs to be done. And I know this is like a gross example, but I think like sometimes like gross examples are what like you will remember, So the thing is like your benchmark for haya with Allah is this example. You wouldn't pick your nose in public, right? So when you're in private, you shouldn't like pick your nose either, right? And so with Allah, if you're not going to do that thing in public, right? Whether it's, watching something you're not supposed to, behaving in a way you're not supposed to, speaking in a way you're not supposed to, posting in a way you're not supposed to, then don't do it privately. And that's your benchmark, right? Because if someone walked in on you like picking your nose, you'd be very embarrassed, right? And so like remember that Allah is always there. Allah is always like walking in on you because he's always there. So have that same level of like, oh no, I can't do this because Allah is watching. And then the next one is people. How are we going to behave with haya when it comes to people, right? And the most common thing that people answer is dress, right? So yes, that is correct. Like how you dress with people is very important, right? But haya with people is so much more than that, right? We have to make sure we don't hurt people with our tongues, which means words, right? But I think it's very important to realize that this whole like idea of like words isn't just what you speak. Words also mean what you write. So if you're on the internet like keyboard warrioring, or being mean to people or like cyberbullying people, like that's the same thing as saying it out loud to their face, right? Or even like behind their backs, like all of that counts as words and using your tongue and speech. And I think a lot of times like people forget that, because if you look at like Facebook or this, like various like online platforms, people are just very mean in how they speak and how they like, say things or react to things. But then you meet that same person in real life and they're nice. And you're like, well, like this person that you're online, or this person that's online is very different than the person that's in real life, right? And I think like a lot of times like people hide behind like the keyboard or like the monitor and stuff like that, and they're just like, oh well, I can say whatever I want because I'm not saying it directly to anyone. But the thing is that like people are reading it, people are being affected by what you write or how you write, and like Allah is making a note of that, right? And then we have to make sure we don't hurt people by our hands, right? Which means physically, right? Like you don't go around like pushing someone randomly or just like punching someone or like, side kicking them or whatever. Like that's just not appropriate behavior for Muslims, period. Um, you know, um, as Muslims, we're supposed to be people. When people come to us, they feel safe around us, right? And so if you're just like, and I understand, like especially with siblings, it's very easy to become aggressive. I think that's a nice polite word to say it. But I mean, like, I remember like me and my siblings when we were younger, we would just constantly be like wrestling, and then like it gets to a point in the fight where you're just like attack, right? And like your parents are like peeling you guys like off each other, and they're like, you guys aren't allowed to touch anyone for the whole day type of thing, and like I understand like we do that, right? But we have to be like very conscious and aware and mindful of like how we use our body parts, because our body parts, even on the day of judgment, they're going to be like, testifying either for us or against us. Like, oh, this person like used their hands to hold the Quran to read, Quran for Allah, or this person used their hands to like write mean things about people on the internet, And then also we need to make sure, what if people are jealous or disrespectful deliberately? So in those cases, like what you have to do is just kind of like rise above it, right? Like one wrong, like two wrongs don't make it right. And we see this a lot of times, even with like the Sirah of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And that's like something like I focus on so much, is every single thing in life, period, can be related back to like a story of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Right? And so you look at like the Muckins when, like the Quraysh were just being like super mean to the Prophet ﷺ, right? There was a time when the Prophet ﷺ was praying by the Kaaba, and they took like the intestines and like the insides of an animal and just like placed it on him. And like this is like something that's really, really, really heavy, right? It's not something like it's not like a phone or something like that where it's just like you just brush it off. Like he was in Sajda Sallallahu and they put it on him, right? And once the Prophet ﷺ gets up, like he doesn't like yell at them or anything like that. He just makes dua to Allah about like, what happened, right? Or, even like during Ta'if, where the Prophet ﷺ was like leaving the city, and like all the kids and all the like, bad people, like not bad people, but like, like the mischievous people, line up for 3 miles outside on the way to like outside of Ta'if on the way to Mecca, and they're throwing pebbles at the Prophet ﷺ. And what he does is he just like bows his head and very humbly just starts walking, even though like every step he took, like a pebble was being thrown at him, right? And so in those cases, like it's very important to like, if it's just out of like jealousy or disrespect or bad behavior, like you don't like engage back, like the Prophet ﷺ didn't like pick up the pebbles and start like hitting, these kids with it either, because that's like two wrongs don't make it right. At the same time, like stand up for yourself, and we're going to talk about this later. There's a difference between standing up for yourself and like standing up for what's right versus just feeding into like the jealousy and disrespect. You don't respond to disrespect with more disrespect. And so like with people, right, like you have to ask, and like like ask yourself, like, are you going to backbite about them? Are you going to be mean? Are you going to cheat people? Are you going to help people? Will you have good manners? Will you be kind? Or are you going to have a hard heart where, like you see something bad, or like, like you'll see an animal on the road, like hurt, like, are you going to be like, whatever, or are you going to be like, oh no, let me try and help it, And then the next thing that you have to have haya with is the self. And this, to be very honest, is like one of the hardest things to do, because you have to ask yourself, like, are you treating yourself well? Or are you going to be cruel to yourself? Are you going to lower yourself to be judged by others? And I remember like back, like, a few years ago, and this might still be happening right now, but there used to be like rating websites, right? Like people would put pictures on the internet and they're like, okay, like rate me, like how good do I look, right? And it was just one of those things where it was a very like cruel thing to do to yourself, because like the thing is like Allah created you perfectly, and to have like other people judge you on like, oh, like I don't know, like your eyebrow hair is out of place or whatever, or I don't know, just something dumb, right? Like that's not like being kind to yourself. That's not having haya for yourself, right? Because that's not like something that you need to do. We shouldn't be so focused on the dunya that we lose our relationship with Allah, right? And a lot of times, yeah, like it's stuff that's like said, like unwisely, and things like that. And then like the other thing that we have to do is like, you have to ask yourself like, will you be and this is like my favorite part of like Sira, or not favorite part, but like one of my favorite like things about like Sira is um you're like encouraged in our religion to ask questions, right? Like you're not supposed to be so shy that if you don't know something about your religion, you don't ask about it. You're not like, oh, well, um, I don't know, let's say wearing the color like purple, for example, is something where, and this is just like a silly example, like this isn't actually like it's just an example. It's not actually related to like fiqh or Islamic law or anything like that. But let's say hypothetically in our culture, wearing purple is seen as like maybe it's okay to do or maybe it's not okay to do, right? Um, if let's say you wear purple and that's your favorite color to wear, are you going to, but you don't know, right? Like, are you going to go to like a scholar, for example, and get that clarification, even though it might be like really embarrassing to ask, because like, let's say like all of the clothes you've got are like purple colored, or are you just going to be like, no, I feel really shy, like the sheikh's like a man, for example, like I don't feel comfortable like asking him if I can wear purple or not. Like, what if he judges me, or what if he X, Y, and Z, right? One thing that the Ansari women, these are the women who lived in Medina, like the Prophet also praised them, because their shyness never like stopped them from getting a better understanding of their religion, right? And so for yourself, what you have to do is like go out there and Um, so what you have to do is like basically go out there and ask and like find out and like learn your religion, right? Like modesty isn't like not know, it's not in the not knowing or the not asking, or I feel too shy to ask about my religion. Like that's not what haya is. Like haya in this case would be to go ask, right? Like it is like the right thing to do is to know what is right and wrong with your religion or how to be better. It's not the opposite. And then the Prophet, or not the Prophet, Surah Al-Araf, there's an ayah about like being cattle, right? And these aren't cattle. I put sheep just because like in our, like, I don't know, like English, you say like, don't be like sheep, right? Not cattle necessarily, but both of them work. So Allah says in the Quran, we have created many jinn and people who are destined for hell. With hearts they do not use for comprehension, right? Like they don't like use their hearts in a very emotionally intelligent way. Eyes they do not use for sight, right? As in like not just like sight, but like also reflection and thinking and like paying attention to what you see. Ears they do not use for hearing, right? Like are you paying attention? Are you being mindful of like what you're hearing? If you hear someone like cry out for help outside of your house, are you just going to ignore it, or like, oh, someone's asking for help, right? Is it background noise, or is it something you pay attention to? They are like cattle. No, even further astray. These are the ones who are entirely heedless, right? And so basically what Allah says is don't be like cattle or sheep, right? The way like we say it, like that's our idiom or like our way of saying it, right? And one really interesting thing, especially being in Texas, we have like a lot of like farmland, right? And actually I've seen this in England too with like sheep and the farmland, but in Texas, like you could be like driving like 100, 110 miles an hour on certain roads, and you'll pass by like these farms and you'll just be like zooming by, right? Like cars are just like zoom, 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 and you'll see like just cattle like literally right by the road. And every time a car like zooms by, like there's just no reaction. They're just, let me just eat the grass, right? There's no like, oh my God, I almost got hit by a car or anything like that. There's no awareness of like, there's a fast car like zooming by me. There's no awareness of like, I wonder what would happen if this car like went off the road and accidentally like hit me or something like that. None of that, right? Versus people, right? Like if you are on the same road and let's say you get a flat tire or something like that, you're very, very, very careful of like making sure you get out when there's like absolutely no cars coming. You'll wait like 5 or 10 minutes to see if there's like that, gap between cars, or if there isn't, you'll like crawl to the passenger side and get out that way. And there's just like a lot more like awareness, right? Versus a cattle where there's just no reaction, right? Or sheep who just like randomly follow without thinking, right? And that's why like, shepherding is sometimes so hard, because I've seen like, I think it's Ireland or something like that, where there's like a lot of cliffs and like sheep can literally just like walk off a cliff because they're just following each other, right? They don't like stop and think like, wait, what am I following? Right? And that's why I really like that sheep on this one, because like right here, like you see the sheep going, wait a minute, what am I doing? Right? So I want to talk about consequences first. And the thing is, like, not having haya, both like from a natural perspective and from an Islamic perspective, like you always like just end up doing things you normally wouldn't do, right? And a lot of this is like driven by like society, our desires, our wants, things we like consume, right? And that's why that hadith, the first one I brought, talks about like consumption, right? And for us, like these days, like consumption isn't just food. It's what we're watching, what we're seeing, what we're hearing, what we're listening to, where we're going, and the thing with like the internet, which it's like wonderful if you use it right, but it can be very dark if you use it wrong, right? Like no one is there to like watch over what's going on, and so if we don't have haya, we literally create a society that's just driven by our desires instead of doing what is right. And you see that like happening in a lot of different places, where people just care about like me, myself, and I versus, okay, and I think we saw this a lot in the pandemic, right? This whole like toilet paper shortage where like people were just like hoarding and stocking up, right? Instead of like, okay, let me just buy what I need right now, and everyone buys what they need, and inshallah like the supply chain will be affected, and that's how like it's always been done. Or like a lot of people didn't even like think about like people who live paycheck to paycheck, they can't buy in bulk, right? And so like a lot of times people went to the grocery store and they're just not buying like normal supplies, because like people would buy like 100 items of the same thing at once in case there is like no food, for example. And so like these are like consequences, like real life consequences that you see and are affected by if there's a lack of haya. But I do want to acknowledge that the struggle is very real, right? Especially for like the youth and like the kids and stuff like that growing up now. Like I grew up in a time where like the internet was like, it was a thing, but it wasn't like this, right? Like we had like dial up when I was like around like, the 7, 6 year old age and stuff like that, like we didn't have like instant access to everything on the internet on our phones. We weren't constantly like, even when you play a game, like a kid's game, you're just like barraged by like ads that are just like not appropriate, right? And it's not like you purposely, sometimes like a lot of times it's not even like I purposely went to watch it. It was just something, it's what popped up, right? And so like, again, I want us to go back to Sierra, right? And I think like if you guys like move forward or like sign up for the classes that I will be doing for the 9 and 12-year-old age, you know, you're gonna see that like there's so many lessons that we can extract from Sirah, and I'm always talking about Sirah because it's so important, right? So in the Sirah, we see so many times where it would have been easier for like the Sahaba to like walk away instead of like doing the right thing, right? The Prophet was already guaranteed Jannah, but he still tried with Allah and he still served the people around him even when he was like treated badly, right? Like he never gave up. And this is where that question about like, well, how do you behave when like someone is like deliberately being disrespectful to you? Like you still try, you know? Even with the Sahaba who are guaranteed Jannah, you know, they still continue to work for Islam and do better and keep trying. They didn't let their like shyness stop them from doing the right thing, right? And I think sometimes, like, especially with like girls, we feel like we don't want to get involved in things, right? Like it could be something like, oh, like I don't want to study like maybe Islam because that's like a boy thing to do. You know, maybe that's not the most modest thing for girls to do. Or I don't want to like volunteer because, you know, like I'm gonna be out there. Or I don't want to stand up for people because, you know, like I just feel very shy about like, you know, speaking up or saying something. But that's not what haya is, right? Haya, like we learn from like the Ansari women, is furthering your education and like doing the right thing and volunteering and standing up for people. And you see that so many times, you know, in Sirah, whether it's like Safiya radiallahu anha, who like, you know, protects like the women and children during the Battle of Khandaq, where like, you know, the enemy people come in the area where all the women and children are, you know, staying. Like she could have been like, oh, I'm shy, the enemy's a guy. No, she like did what she needed to do and she protected, you know, all the women and children right there. We see like the Ansari women constantly like asking the Prophet ﷺ for clarifications on what he said because they want to make sure that their understanding and their knowledge of the deen is correct, right? And you know, like we even see like the women of like both Mecca and Medina, like when there was like a battle, they were out there helping, like giving water, bandaging the sick people, or the wounded or whatever. You know, it wasn't like, oh, I feel very like shy about it. Like sometimes we use shyness as like a form of like cowardice almost, but like we have to be bold as Muslims, right? Like we have to like go out there and do what needs to be done. And I understand like not every single person will feel comfortable like maybe like furthering their education or volunteering or, you know, like standing up for like what you're supposed, like people's rights or whatever, but like find what you're passionate about, and work towards that. Like you're not expected to do everything and be everything, but like find out where your niche is and go for it, right? Like be bold and be like Muslim women in it, right? Like be like channel your inner Ansari woman. Oh no, there we go. Okay, so the whole purpose of like, you know, like the last like 42 minutes I've been speaking, right? The whole purpose is to get closer to Allah, make him happy and get to Jannah, right? And whatever like you do, like whenever you do something, like ask yourself, like, would Allah be happy with what I'm doing, what I'm saying, what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling, how I'm like, you know, responding to things or reacting to things, you know? Not only that, but like, are my clothing choices, behavior choices, thought choices, action choices morally conscious, morally right? Are I being mindful of Allah? Are they something that Allah approves of? Right? And like, if you start asking yourself these questions, you're gonna find, you know, and this is something I do with myself also. Like, I ask myself, okay, like, where can I improve in my life? Right? So, okay, maybe I'm too reactive sometimes, right? And that's not the best haya with like interactions, right? Or maybe I sometimes like I maybe it's like, oh, I delay Salah because I want to finish watching TV or finish a game or whatever, right? That's also not haya because I'm not being mindful of Allah, right? Maybe like you say stuff that is like, you know, bad about like your classmates or something like that. Like you get really annoyed at something they did, and then like you go and like tell your best friend just to like not vent or anything, but just to like speak badly about them and make them like go like, oh yeah, like they really suck or something like that. That's not haya, right? So once you start asking yourself like, is this something Allah is going to be happy with? you're going to be able to like figure out where these lines are. But one thing to remember is like Allah doesn't expect us to be perfect, right? Like even Adam alayhi salam and Hawa alayhi salam, like they weren't perfect, right? They ate from the tree and they were sent to like earth, right? Like, and Allah always like meant for it to happen that way, right? It was already written, so we don't like blame them or like speak badly about it or anything like that. But what we take from that is like even like everyone like created the people of Adam, right, which is us, like the children of Adam alayhi salam. Like we always make mistakes, we're not perfect, right? But what Allah does expect from us is it's not perfection, but like try, right? Like he expects us to try. And Allah's not like Yoda where it's like do or do not, right? Like there is no try. Like with Allah there is try. With Allah is like the only place you're going to get an A for effort, right? Like even if you're trying, let's say you are trying to, I don't know, like not watch TV anymore, for example, but then you keep slipping up, right? Like every day you wake up and you're like, I'm never gonna watch TV again because like everything on TV is bad. Which I'm not saying like, good or bad. I'm not like commenting on TV in that sense. But let's say that's your like version of getting closer to Allah, or that's your goal, or that's what you're trying to do in order to get closer to Allah, right? But let's say, or even like Salah, for example, let's say your goal is like, I'm going to pray Salah right as like time comes in, right? You hear the adhan, you go pray. But every day for the rest of your life, you're like failing at that because something happens where you're not able to do it, right? Even if you try every day you wake up, you're like, today is the day, it's going to be all on time, but you fail every single day, Allah still gives you credit for trying. That intention that you make of like, caring about what Allah thinks and trying to do the right thing, Allah cares and Allah like takes a note of that, right? And we can't do that with like people, right? Like people, like if someone is like, oh, I want to be like nicer to you, like if your sibling's like, I'm gonna be nicer to you today, I promise I'm not gonna steal your like toy without your permission or whatever, but they do it every single day, at some point you're just gonna be like, yeah, whatever, right? I don't believe you anymore, right? But Allah doesn't do that. He's like super merciful. And I think that's like what we need to realize with Allah is like his mercy is like all encompassing. And Allah says that in the Quran. And so like with us, like what I want you guys to take away from today is pick one thing that you want to be better at and work on that with Allah, right? In terms of like having better like moral consciousness or haya with either Allah or people or yourself, wherever you think you need to work on, do that, right? It could be something as simple as like, I'm going to pray Salah on time, or I'm not going to rush through Salah when I read it, or I'm going to be more conscious of what I'm saying or how I read my Quran when I'm reading Salah, or I'm going to pray Salah even when my parents aren't around, right? Whatever you want. And it doesn't have to be Salah, right? That's like an example with Allah. It could be like, I'm going to say nice things to my siblings instead of being mean to them. Or it could be like, you know what? I'm not going to let my shyness stop me from asking questions when I don't understand a meaning of something or get a clarification on it, even though some people might think, oh, like that's a dumb question and stuff like that, right? Like, and I'm guilty of that too. Like in class when I'm sitting, sometimes I'm like, oh, I don't know if this is like a good question to ask. Maybe it sounds stupid or, whatever, but ask, right? And I'm always happy whenever I ask because, especially with like, online Zoom classes now, you'll get like a classmate on the side, like texting you. They're like, oh, thank you for asking. Like I had that same question, right? And so like I just want everyone to like pick one thing in their life that you guys can like work on, and it's a very gradual thing. Like we have to remember, like this is not a sprint, but a marathon. It's like, and that's why I have like the tortoise and the hare, right? Like it's you have to play the long game. It's not something that you're, okay, let me do it for like a day or two and magically, or miraculously, like it's just going to be perfect. It's something that we have to work towards and struggle with every day, and I think for like younger like students, and younger people these days, like the internet and like your screen time and gaming and constantly being attached to your screens is one of your biggest struggles, you know? And as an adult, like I feel that, but I can't imagine like just, you know, like I remember like when we used to have just like free play, right? Like you just go outside and play around versus nowadays, like kids are just glued to the screen, you know? Like step away from that because sometimes when we're doing that, like we turn into the cattle, right? Where we're not like, we're so invested in what our like phone is to like what game we're playing on our phone or screen, like we're not aware of what's going on around us, right? So I just want to like bring it this conversation back to like what we talked about in the beginning with the two roads, right? We could be people who go to that giant party, or we could be people who choose the more restrictive and calmer side. And the giant party, like I want to like remind you guys, like it's something that will eventually lead to chaos because no one will care about anyone anymore, right? Like there will be like a complete lack of haya, both like from a natural perspective in terms of like clothing and shame, but also from like an Islamic perspective. Like no one will care what Allah thinks, you know, because you're just too focused on what you want instead of what Allah wants. Or you can like go to the commerce side, which in this dunya, yeah, I'll be honest, like I'm not going to sugarcoat it, right? It is harder, you know, like it's hard to like control your tongue and your behavior and actions because it's so easy, like when someone makes you mad to like just, I don't know, like if you want to just like knock something over, just knock it over and just like let them know you're mad. Like it's easy to do that, right? And it feels good in that moment sometimes, but then you feel a little bad, right? But the commerce side in the long run leads you to Jannah because you're like, okay, me knocking something over when I'm angry isn't something Allah's going to be proud of. He's not going to give me a thumbs up on the day of judgment because he's like, oh yeah, like I loved it when you knocked over that thing when you were angry. No, he's not going to say that. He's going to be like, I loved it when you showed restraint when your sibling made you mad, you know, or I love it when you showed, you know, thoughtfulness when it came to your salah and you didn't rush it, you know, like that's what Allah is going to give you like an A plus for. And just know that like this, like being like more restrained in this dunya will eventually lead you to Jannah because you know, like that's what Allah tells you. That's what Allah promises you. Like you do what Allah says, you get to go to Jannah. And that's where like the real party is. And I think sometimes in this dunya we get like, you know, our like minds are clouded by like the now and the desires that we want, you know, now. But to be honest, like even like in this dunya, when you go after like what you desire the most, there's always consequences to it, right? Like let's say you are like, okay, I'm gonna eat that chocolate pie for dinner, you're going to have a stomach ache the whole night and you're not going to sleep well. And then the next morning you're going to be groggy and mean and cranky, right? Like that's just how this works. But in Jannah, like you want all the cake, all the stuff you want, like Allah will give it to you and it'll be the best version of everything, you know? And like the cool thing about Jannah is like with food, like, you know, like each day, like each time you eat it, it tastes even better versus like, I don't know, like food here, like if you eat like a giant sheet cake, at some point it just kind of like you can feel the texture of it, but you can't taste it anymore, you know? It's not satisfying. So that's why we have to like always just like be mindful of like the haya and um like just be morally aware of Allah and his rules, both from like a shame perspective and that natural, you know, modesty and perspective and like being bashful, but also like making sure we're going out there and doing the right thing. So I really, really appreciate everyone for coming to this class. We will be having classes starting not today, Saturday, but next Saturday, and then the next Sunday, which is the 16th and 17th for girls. It's Islamic morals and conducts, and there's like two classes, 9 to 12 and 13 through 17. If anyone has any questions or comments or reflections, like feel free to share it. I know I missed a couple of questions. So there's a question that says, sometimes people say modest girls are not smart. Can smartness be contrary to the religious, or I guess to religion or modesty? Smartness is not contrary to religion or modesty. And we see that like directly with like the Prophet ﷺ like praising the Ansari women, that, you know, he praised them for asking questions and learning about their deen. So that's not, that goes almost against what Islam actually says. Like, you're supposed to go learn your deen. You're supposed to go out there and be smart. Like, you look at Aisha radiallahu anha, she narrated the most amount of like unique hadith, right? Like from one, you know, like but the thing about her is like she was like a genius, right? Like she was great in like, you know, fiqh, which is like the legal matters, and the tarbiyah, which is like the mentorship aspects of it. She's responsible for like so much of our deen being spread to us, right? And she's like the mother of the believers, right? But she was also like, you look at her personality, and she wasn't like she was very like assertive. She was very bold as a person. She was very smart. She was always like learning things. And so like that's very like important to like distinguish like modesty. If you say like modest, if you say that if you're smart then you're not modest, you're missing the point of what modesty is. That's not what modesty is, right? And like you have, that's why like the Ansari women are so important. Like you have to like learn. I hope that answers it. If it doesn't, like just send me another chat and I can answer that more. I know like, so a lot of times I'm seeing a lot of comments about like modest women, for example, but like haya applies to men also, right? Like it's not just modest women, but modest men. And I just want to like clarify that or just point that out, because you look at like Uthman radiallahu anhu, like the Prophet also like one time was like lounging, you know, like just not like lounging like we do, but just kind of like relaxing or sitting in a more relaxed way in his house. And Uthman radiallahu anhu comes to him, and there were other Sahabas there, but when he sees like, you know, his son-in-law coming, he like gets up and like gets more presentable and stuff like that. And I mean, this is like the Prophet ﷺ. He's never like unpresentable, right? But he just makes sure he's like extra presentable, right? And the people around him are like, why are you doing that? And he's like, Uthman radiallahu anhu is coming, because the angels have like, he's such a person, he's a person that has so much haya that the angels even feel like shy around him sometimes, right? And so like I know with like men for a lot of times, and again, like all the things that I've said, especially about the Islamic aspect of what haya is, watching what you do, watching, you know, what you like, how you behave, action, speech, all of that, like all of that applies to men also. Clothing, like men have like haya when it comes to clothing also. You know, it's not just like, haya is not just like a woman's topic, you know, like men have their own form of clothing that is mandated upon them by Allah. So I just want to like clarify that, because it's not just about a woman who like fears her creator, it's also about a man, you know. And like with a lot of guys, sometimes like what I've seen in the you know, past is like sometimes they're very like aggressive or like inappropriate in speech, right? Like that's not having haya, right? Like it comes in many forms, and I just want to like make sure like everyone's on the same page when it comes to that. Like I'm not just talking to women, and it's not just like a women's issue, it's a both genders issue. Okay, so if anyone has any more questions, we have about 2 minutes left. But like feel free to type it in the question box. And I think like one thing because there's like a lot of comments that I'm seeing, I think one thing to remember is like everyone is like at different points in their journey when it comes to Islam. So maybe what is selfish to you might be like really hard for them to have gotten to that point. And so like we always need to focus on ourselves and how we can be better instead of just like judging people. Like, you know, let's say like someone struggled to like, let's say there's let's say there's a guy and he like struggled with like proper speech, right? Like appropriate speech. And he like every time he talked, he was very like obscene in his language or like rude about how he spoke. But let's say he's like, okay, you know what? I realize it's wrong. I'm going to try to be better. And let's say he gets to a point where he's like, okay, I'm not going to make like inappropriate jokes anymore, but maybe he still isn't like at a point where he can stop cursing, you know, or using swear words, but he has completely stopped, you know, making like inappropriate jokes or inappropriate language in that sense, right? If someone from the outside comes and like hears him talking for the first time and he's like using swear words, instead of going, oh wow, like you don't have heyo, you're using bad words, you know, astaghfirullah, brother, like you have to realize that he's made progress, you know, and Allah is like giving him like Jannah points for making that progress in terms of like speech, you know, but he might not be at the ideal level, but he's trying. And for Allah, that is what counts. And so, like, instead of us like writing off people and using words like selfish or like immodest or whatever, you know, like we need to have mercy when it comes to people in terms of like, okay, well, you know, let me get to know that person. Maybe after you know that person, you realize, oh, he stopped doing like all these X, Y, and Z's, but he's still working on like, you know, A for him, right? So I think that's like really important to know. There's a question about niqab. I'm not actually qualified to answer that question. It's more of like a fiqh issue. And so I would just recommend like maybe reaching out to, you know, your like local scholar. Because I know there's like, it's a more broader topic. So in terms of like this class, like that's not like something I had like read up on or studied on. So, okay. So if there's no more questions, Sister Jasmine, are you on here? Sorry. Yeah, but like please also remember to you know, like sign up for our classes if you're interested. We're going to be covering a lot of like interesting topics that range from like, you know, like sincerity and giving and hospitality and all of that stuff. So inshallah, like it'll be beneficial to like all the students, and like we're gonna try to like use it in a way that like is like applicable to like the lives of like the girls that are growing up like in our times, you know. Um, so there's another question. May I read Quran without Auzubillah about having curry? Again, I would just talk to like your local scholar on that. Like I studied some fiqh, but I'm not at a place where I can necessarily say yes or no or give you like the fatwas on it or anything. So I would just ask like your local scholar or maybe a more you know, like a scholar or something like that. So I guess since there's no other questions, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for like joining us. I really, really appreciate it. And inshallah, like, you know, y'all sign up if you want to. And I just appreciate your time. Assalamu alaikum.